Hello, students. I will be presenting today's lesson and explaining how to do the worksheet that accompanies this recording. So in last week's lesson 6.08, the slavery debate, we learned about the Compromise of 1850. This compromise between the Northerners and Southerners decided how to add California as a new state. The provisions allowed California to become a new free state, and the South got the Fugitive Slave Act, which forced Northerners to return runaway slaves back to the South. At this time, the country felt they could push the slavery issue to a future date. They would not have to discuss about it right now. It was settled for now. They would come back to it later. So Southerners and some Northerners wanted slavery to still exist, however, not expand. So it would just stay in the South. Most Southerners were on board with popular sovereignty, which meant that states had the right to vote on whether slavery should exist there. Most Northerners wanted slavery contained and should stay just in the South and not expand anywhere else. So if it starts expanding elsewhere in the US, it's going to be extremely difficult to get rid of. So shortly after the Compromise of 1850, the issue of granting statehoods to the territories of Kansas and Nebraska takes place. A senator from Illinois really wants them to become states, like super bad. His name is Stephen Douglas, and he's right here. So he is a new and up and coming senator from a northern state, but Stephen Douglas at this time is in favor of allowing slavery to expand. And you're probably wondering, you're like, Miss G, why would he want slavery to expand if he's a northerner? Like, that just doesn't make sense based on what you just said. So you need to know at this point in history, most Southerners were Democrats. However, keep in mind, political parties would eventually flip, meaning that Democrats back then don't believe what Democrats do now. So this is the same with the Republican Party. They changed and traded their beliefs and ideologies with each other. So going back to Stephen Douglas, he was a Democrat. Those who were typically Democrat were Southerners and in favor of slavery. So in order to keep winning re-elections in the northern states, such as Illinois that he was in, he needs to be a part of the party and support their positions and beliefs. So it should be the people's decision on whether or not slavery should exist. So going back to the popular sovereignty. So due to Kansas and Nebraska's proximity to Illinois, he wants these states to be developed and have farmers grow their crops here. So if Kansas and Nebraska were to become prosperous, they would have to send their products through Illinois and their railroads to get over to the East Coast. This would help Illinois and particularly Chicago grow and give Douglas a good reputation within his state. And this is especially important because he had ambitions to become the president, and his best chance to do this was to win over Southern Democrats, since there weren't very many Northern Democrats at that time. So then we're going to move on here to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So Douglas introduces this act to the Senate, which also ends up getting passed through the Senate as well. His belief is that this is going to make the North and South happy. Like, he wins both sides, everybody's going to be happy. Kansas and Nebraska are not ideal states to grow crops that are typically present in the South. So therefore, he argued that the North wouldn't have that much slavery expand through those two states. This would make the Northerners happy, and the Southerners would support him due to allowing slavery be present in those two states. So Kansas and Nebraska would now vote on whether they would like slavery to exist in their states. Northerners, however, were upset by this because more Northerners were starting to become abolitionists and thought that slavery needed to end and not expand. So this furthered the tensions between the two regions, the North and the South. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, by definition, is the law that passed on whether Kansas and Nebraska were to have slavery or not. It was meant to become a compromise due to the low amount of slavery that was going to be present that would appease the Northerners and would allow Southerners to bring up slaves to the region if they wanted to go to these two states. Okay, so at this point, the Democratic Party tended to be farmers and poor people, along with rich Southern plantation owners. If you were middle class, wealthier but not through plantations, or an abolitionist, you would support another party. Because of issues such as the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the rise of literature through abolitionists against slavery, such as Uncle Tom's Cabin, many Northern Democrats were beginning to change their party. The issue of slavery was just too big and too important, and they couldn't support Democrats anymore. So what they ended up doing, they were pretty upset about everything that was going on, and they ended up forming the Republican Party. So you can't view political parties back then the way that you do now. So we kind of already talked about this a little bit. So if you look at a map today, most northern states are Democratic and southern states are Republican. In 1850, that was the opposite. The beliefs would stay the same, but the parties would switch what they believe in. It is something you will learn more about in 10th grade, but we're not going to really expand into now. So anyone in the North who was against slavery was joining the Republican Party, and their goal was to stop slavery from expanding into new territories. So now we're going to go back to John Brown. You learned about him a little earlier in lesson 6.09, the Trouble in Kansas assignment, and he was a pretty crazy guy. So he prophesized what the Civil War would become. He believed that it was necessary for the US to enter a bloody, violent conflict to end slavery. So in hindsight, knowing how history played out, I guess, he was kind of right. Brown took things further by trying to start the Civil War on his own and by going and killing people across the country and beginning slave rebellions in different places. So John Brown really believed that he was God's chosen instrument to end slavery, and it was his destiny to do just that. He doesn't achieve that, but he does go further to enrage Northerners and Southerners, leading to the war, and slavery eventually would go away. Okay, so we're going to talk about Stephen Douglas here a little more. So Stephen Douglas was wrong about how Kansas and Nebraska would play out. Thousands of people came to the area to vote illegally. So Southerners came from other states such as Missouri and Texas and would stay there for a few days to cast their vote in the election. They really wanted to tip and turn the scale, and it was pretty hard back then to prove your identity and like where you actually lived. So Southerners and Northerners were able to vote in this election illegally. So like I was saying, the Southerners wanted enough votes to tip the election in favor of allowing slavery to stay and exist in those two territories in Kansas and Nebraska. So going back to John Brown here a little bit, he and other Northerners heard about this and they were like, oh, heck no, we are not going to allow this to happen. Like, that's not okay. And they went to Kansas to find the Southerners who were leading this effort. And these Northerners ended up killing some of the Southerners there. So this brings outrage to the Kansas area. People are pissed off. As you see right here, this is John Brown arriving with a storm coming around him. There's a tornado you can see. There's a fire. And Brown himself is standing on the bodies of a Union and a Confederate soldier. So the idea is that he wants to start the conflict himself, and actually leads some historians to saying that the Civil War started here in Kansas due to this event, even though the actual Civil War did not start for several years later. So going back to John Brown here, he ends up escaping and goes into hiding for a while. We're gonna see him come up a little later. And he's actually really good friends with Harriet Tubman and other abolitionists, and he's just trying to plan his next move. Like, what is he gonna do next? Okay, so now we're going to move on to a very important Supreme Court case that was being decided on. So many of you might have heard of Dred Scott already. So he was a slave who believed if he was brought into a territory that was free, so an example here is Minnesota had slavery was illegal, that he should be free. If he was brought from a southern state where there was slavery and he gets brought up to a northern state where slavery is not allowed, that he should be free. In Minnesota, him and his owner were actually living in Fort Snelling. So at the time in the law, there was this gray area, like, should he be free or should he not be free? And Scott ended up suing his owner for freedom. The Supreme Court ended up hearing the case and they decided to do two things about it. So one, they ruled in a pretty racist way that as a slave, he was considered property and does not have any rights and is not able to sue anyone. The Supreme Court took things even further after that by deciding that the federal government has no power to ban slavery anywhere. Since the founding fathers allowed slavery to exist, and through the 3/5 compromise, they were considered 3/5 the person, we should allow slavery to exist now since the founding fathers did back then. Okay, so this ends up bringing quite a bit of outrage to the North because it limits the federal government's ability to do anything about slavery. The compromise and everything prior to this Supreme Court decision just don't matter anymore. This will eventually change once we get into the Civil War and the makeup of the Supreme Court shifts, and they will eventually rule against slavery. But for now, it's a pretty big blow. So here's some of Abraham Lincoln's background if you want to read about him. I'm not going to really go over his background as much, but it's there for you if you want to pause and read it. But I'm going to continue on to the next slide. Okay, so now we're going to go on to the Lincoln-Douglas debates. So Abraham Lincoln was one of the most well-known presidents, and prior to the president, he was known for his role in these debates. So in 1858, he ran for the Senate seat, which he ended up losing to the incumbent Douglas that we were already talking about. He loses the election, but gains national acclaim and eventually becomes the Republican candidate for president. Lincoln gets into debates between Douglas and wants to kick him out of power and take over that Senate spot. The debates become very big and national news due to it being centered on slavery. So Lincoln supported minority rights, which meant that we can't take the rights away from a group of people just because they aren't the biggest group in the country. So enslaved people and African Americans deserve to have rights as listed in the Constitution, just like everybody else, including being free from slavery. So Douglas argued, on the other hand, he was like, nope, that's not the way that it should be. He was in favor of majority rule. So what that meant is that those people in power should make the rules for everybody else. More people would benefit from those rulings, even if a percentage of people did not benefit from them. So Lincoln was like, nope, I don't agree with this. And just because you are in the minority, you lose your rights. That's not okay. So Lincoln ends up losing the election, but he becomes, a very household name after this, leading up into the president election of 1860. So now we're going to go back to John Brown. He's back. So he decides to attack Harper's Ferry in Virginia that holds a federal arsenal where a lot of ammunition, weapons, cannons, and guns are being stored. He wants to take this group and steal all the weapons and free the slaves in the area to start the Civil War on his own. He was in communication with Harriet Tubman, who was willing to provide reinforcement to help him and bring a group of people down there to join the effort. However, Harriet does not make it down there, and there are speculations that she was growing sick at the time or didn't think that his plan would work out. So Brown successfully gets the arsenal, gets these weapons. However, the National Army ends up arriving and he is eventually captured. He was deemed a hero by Northerners and had the right message and goal to end slavery, but they were becoming more concerned about the violence he brought with him. Southerners were also super mad about this and mad that Northerners supported this guy. Okay, so moving on to the election of 1860. So this was split up between 4 candidates, with one of them being eventual President Lincoln here. There's actually one more thing I wanted to go back. I didn't mention that Brown ended up being hung later that year, and so I wanted to readdress that there. Okay, so Lincoln was one of the 4 candidates, and there were 2 prominent Democrats, Douglas, who we've already learned about from the Northern Democrats, and then Breckinridge, the Southern Democrat. Due to the split that ended up occurring between these 2 candidates right here, neither candidate could get enough votes to match Lincoln. So Lincoln would end up winning this election. The thing is that Lincoln did not campaign or appear on the ticket in several Southern states, so he just was not on the ticket at all, so people couldn't vote for him. But the North's population was a lot larger. As you can see up here, a lot of the northern states have more delegates. Therefore, they had more sway in the election, and the Southerners and Democrats did not stand a chance, and Lincoln had won the election. So this leads to something very important happening. The South is super upset about it, and they're like, wow, we're not going to be in power anymore, and we're losing sway. So what they do, they decide at this point that they want to break away or to secede from the US and become the Confederate States of America. Under their own country, they would be free from Lincoln and Northern influence, and slavery could continue there. This secession event leads to the Civil War, and we will go more into the Civil War within our next unit. And then after we're done with that unit, then we will start talking about the period after the war called the Reconstruction period. So that is it for the lesson. And now I'm going to go over to the assignment here, if my mouse lets me. There we go. So here's the assignment that you need to do. So after finishing the recording, you need to go in and explain how each event or term further divided the North and the South, inching them closer to the Civil War. So each response should be 3 to 4 sentences. You should be using the recording that you're in right now and the textbook to answer any of these questions. You are not defining what the event was, but are explaining how that specific event further divided the North and South leading up to the Civil War. So I have completed the first one as an example for you. So the issue is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act was designed to use popular sovereignty to determine whether or not slavery should be allowed in Kansas or Nebraska. So with popular sovereignty, remember that, you get the decision whether or not, through voting, if slavery should be allowed there or not. So a lot of Northerners were upset because many now believe slavery should not exist in any form. So many historians now claim the Civil War actually began in Kansas as tensions there led to significant violence and bloodshed over the vote on slavery. So you are going to go and do what I did there for these 1, 2, 3, 4 events. So that is it for today. If you have any questions for me, feel free to reach out to me and email me. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day. Bye.